Here we go. Kim Baskin is an independent writer and speaker who specializes in examining issues from the perspective of complexity science and the emerging worldview of which it is a part. He has written essays in both scholarly journals and books of collected essays in fields ranging from healthcare and anthropology to organizational and religious studies. Um, his works include a guide to thinking about organizations as living beings. For example, the book Corporate DNA, also written Axial Age and Modernity, Axial Age is a World History, co-written with anthropologist Dmitry Bondarenko. He is currently reinterpreting religion as a neurobiological imperative by which groups of people come to know and respond to the powerful, sometimes mysterious, invisible forces that surround them. He has a PhD in English language and literature from the University of Maryland and taught for many years at Temple University in Philadelphia. And then he also has written for several corporations, both as staff member and as consultant, and he lives in Philadelphia. Ken?
Thank you, David. I want to thank everybody. Has been a wonderful symposium so far. And I'm apt. Oh, by the way, I definitely want to thank David and Daniel for all the work they did. Um, I am overwhelmed that the underlying uh, story that we're talking about is the Kuhnian paradigm shift that's emerging today to replace the Clockwork Universe. Um, my favorite example is in all the commotion over the space photos we have, including I was reading about a journal essay in a peer-reviewed journal that was speculating that the laws governing dark matter evolved. And I grew up at a time where if you said that in a classroom, they were very, very upset. So I want to talk about the shift uh, and the way it grounds our thinking in principles of systems thinking or complexity science rather than Newtonian physics. And I'm going to offer, and the question for me is how can the IBHA contribute to this shift? So I want to talk about cognosis. It's a positive feedback loop grounded in the way our brains work that maps cultural evolution. It has four phases that enable societies to revitalize themselves in the face of disruptive change. And with it, history is no longer a linear chain of events, but an expanding spiral of population, technology, trade, and social complexity. It is still very new and needs to be questioned and tested, but I think it illustrates some of the ways the IBHA can enhance the process of the ongoing paradigm shift. And I want to touch on four issues. First, how I stumbled onto cognosis. Second, why I think it's a neurobiological imperative. Third, I want to describe it as a four-phase feedback loop. And finally, a few comments about the IBHA's future. So I fell down the rabbit hole of cognosis when Dmitry Bondarenko and I decided to write Axial Ages of World History. There we examine the last 5,000 years of cultural evolution in terms of punctuated equilibrium, which we've been discussing, which shows evolution as an alternation between relatively long, stable periods and shorter periods of transformation. Complexity theory, they call it phase transitions. Now, Dmitry and I noticed that dominant polities across Eurasia at any given time had similar socio-political structures. So, as you can see from this diagram, an age of kingdoms starting around 3000 BC made enormous progress to the point that it changed the environment so much that it had made it possible to conquer vast empires. And that precipitated the Axial Age, which allowed an enormous amount of experimentation from about 800 to 200 BC and gave birth to an age of empires, which would continue until 1500 approximately, when another phase transition, modernity, include. What shocked us was how important the rewriting of traditional myth was in every case. For instance, we noticed that in the Axial Age in Greece, the history of the 5th century seemed almost to be scripted by Homer's epics, which were recorded about 300 years earlier. In the Iliad, a collection of independent kingdoms fight like brothers until challenged by an enemy from the east, Troy. They unite, defeat the enemy, and go back to fighting like brothers. In 5th century Greece, the networks of city-states also fight like brothers until challenged by their enemy from the east, Persia. They defeat that enemy and return to fighting like brothers, leading the horrors of the Peloponnesian Wars. This similarity has always been there, but I never saw it in front of me. And so then I remembered David Sloan Wilson's comment. In many ways, scientists and other intellectuals can't see what's in front of their faces because what's in back of their faces, the ideas that shape perception. He didn't mean this as a criticism. It's a statement of how our minds work, especially at a time of paradigm shift, because we all grew up with the old paradigm, and it has affected us in ways we don't recognize. Cognosis resulted from facing this obstacle, and I was able to do so by incorporating research from many fields. So the question that hit me was, how could centuries-old myth affect unfolding events? I'd read a lot about myths, but only an Egyptologist named Jan Osman even discussed the role of myth in cultural evolution. And the question was, is myth really what I learned it was, which is what Scott Atran calls a counterfactual and counterintuitive world of supernatural agents? Or is it really a matter of how the brain works? Consider the key human survival challenge. Quantum physics describes reality as the raw stuff that's out there, a chaotic energy field that our senses can't perceive, very much like the Chinese idea of qi. So in order to navigate this reality, we create models. And the purpose of the models is not to show us as it is, the world as it is, but to ensure we can see specifically those things that are coming to help or hurt us. It's about survival. And the resulting perceptions can be so distorted that one neurobiologist calls perception a controlled hallucination. And again, that's much like the Indian idea of Maya. So consider vision. As I look around my office here, I feel that my eyes are drinking in full, accurate images of what's out there. But neurobiology tells us that the human brain works much more like a subconscious storyteller, allowing us to explain what's happening. We can see because each retina has 100 million photosensitive cells, each of which records one dot of light. And so your eyes are sending these vast fields of fragmented information to your brain, which constructs them into images, compares them to your memory, and then runs them by the mental models, what you've learned about how the world should and shouldn't work. And what you come up with is eventually your subconscious delivers a coherent story-like model to explain the events around you to your consciousness. Now, it's very difficult because because storytelling leaves out a lot of information, and its purpose, as I said, isn't accuracy but survival. And that was a shocking realization. Our subconscious is continually filtering out what becomes conscious, even though we're not aware of what it filters. You may recognize this from the last time that you had to search your house 3 times to find your keys, and you realized that you'd looked twice at the spot where it was and didn't see it. So the question is, how can we survive with models that are so distorted? And the answer is that our models and experience repeatedly modify one another so that the observer is deeply linked in a feedback loop to the outside world. The brain creates models, we enact the model, we observe the results, we create the model, and it goes over and over and over. And in time, what happens is the neural network, the set of nerves that govern this, change physiologically so that the response is faster and faster, and you have a habit. This way of surviving is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it shapes our perception so that we know how to respond quickly in most situations. On the other hand, we can mistake our models of reality for what we created them to explain. And the result is that we can hypnotize ourselves into seeing what our models tell us should be there, which is basically what Wilson's observation is about. There's another difficulty involved. Because perception is shaped by individual experience of survival challenges, the world each of us perceives can be significantly different. And if you're not sure about that, talk to a friend who's been married for 20 years. Yet many survival challenges demand cooperation throughout society. As a result, our brains evolved a key mental model, the shared symbolic order, which allows us to interpret reality according to the same symbolic thought, and people in communities can work together on common problems. And this order is encoded in myth. Now, if you think about ancient Egypt, its major challenge concerned the Nile and the way it flooded every year, producing tremendous harvests. And so its symbolic order ended up being the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. On the other hand, in the West, we were introducing a society based on the machine. And so we developed the Clockwork Universe. And so the order is encoded in myth, and I'm convinced that the gods represent the unseen forces that create the challenges we have to meet. And so the question is, does it make sense to re-examine myth, not as part of religion, but as a symbolic effort to understand those unseen forces that create our survival challenges? From this point of view, the reason that Homeric myth seems to script 5th century Greek history is that myth provides the information that a society needs to operate as a sort of cultural DNA that can be repeatedly debated, disputed, and filtered, to use a wonderful phrase from Merlin Donald. As storytelling is essential for individual survival, myth-making allows cultural survival equally. And that brings me to cognosis. Cognosis maps cultural evolution's dynamic through 4 overlapping phases. You start with a stable culture, which for me is one whose traditional myth allows it to address its survival challenges. Over time, the world changes, and a challenge will arise that seems insoluble. And that'll trip the wire for a process of mythic rewriting, and people will rewrite the myth and try to act on it over and over until finally a new myth evolves. And this can take generations. New myth will evolve that introduces a new domain of knowledge and allows the society to recreate stability. Now, as an example, I want to use Greece in the Axial Age again. And the Greeks faced the same challenge that occurred in China and India. Monocultural Bronze Age kingdoms became multicultural Iron Age empires, and they needed a new symbolic order in order to govern these vast, diverse populations. So, in the first the Greek experience gets interesting in the 8th century when you get Homer writing down the epics and the early city-states forming networks. They were able to meet their challenges by enacting the Homeric myth of many independent polities fighting like brothers. And they were able also to unite to deal with other states. But with the Persian Wars of 490 and 480, problems appeared because this was so far from the dynamics of the Trojan War. The War of 480 had the Persians had iron-wielding armies of 200,000. They sacked Athens twice and spread fear of alien conquest. So even when the Greeks won, they returned and they reenacted that Homeric myth, and they started fighting like brothers, and it resulted in the Peloponnesian Wars, which ultimately destroyed their power. And as Thucydides points out, frantic violence became the attribute of manliness. The advocate of extreme measure was always trustworthy, his opponent a man to be suspected. Thus every form of iniquity took root. And you may recognize that. Now, in response, the Greek elite would begin reprocessing its myth, especially in the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And they introduced a mythic twist. In Homer, the Greek gods are terribly irrational. I mean, a beauty contest causes the Trojan War. But people in the myths accept it in stride. When you get to the tragedies, Agamemnon in 458, Oedipus in 429, the Bacchae in 404, the gods' irrational actions drive royal families to literally tear each other apart. So that what we have is a discussion of how to deal with unseen forces that were tearing Greek life apart. Developments in science and philosophy also contributed to the effort. And by the end of the 5th century, the philosophical myth of Plato and Aristotle were beginning to transform Greek thought. This is the final phase of cognosis, and it focused on rational control of the irrational. It would organize Alexander's empire in Rome, and similar transformations were happening in India, where the warrior culture of the Mahabharata would be transformed into the spiritual seeking of the Bhagavad Gita, and in China, where the religion of the Zhao dynasty would eventually become Confucianism. So the question. Also, I wanted to point out that I think today we're in the final stage of cognosis. The Clockwork Universe has created problems like global warming that block us from addressing them. So thinkers, some thinkers may argue that modernity is driven by math, not myth. But if you look at the New Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon, a member of the elite who largely invented Western science, he was creating a myth of a scientific society right down to describing a precursor of England's Royal Society. And it was myth without traditional gods. And I think perhaps at the Tokyo conference, I can develop a fuller discussion of cognosis in modernity. Ultimately, for me, the question is cognosis a valuable way to think about cultural evolution? And all I can say is perhaps. It's still evolving and needs a lot of thought and research. Its real value to us today, here and today, may be that it points to a new paradigm conception of history. It does that by replacing old paradigm assumptions grounded in Newtonian physics with principles from complexity science. It integrates the results from many disciplines. It's nonlinear in its extensive use of positive feedback loops. And it examined responses on many scales from individual neurons to international relations. And because it's no longer bound to those old assumptions, it points to provocative provocative possibilities that deserve further explanation. That myth is not merely religious stories, or that in human history, order and chaos have produced each other through self-organization. So at the risk of being misunderstood, I think this approach is playful. That is, like the gang I used to play ball with on the streets when I was 7. We should be willing to create new rules and see where that leads us. And so what I'd like to suggest is what Todd was suggesting. It would be wonderful if we could aim to create a platform, some sort of clearinghouse on which thinkers from different fields can play with each other and draw upon the insights from other fields. Perhaps we could facilitate personal networks. Perhaps we could find a way of incorporating AI. Perhaps we can work even more on making connections to organizations like the ISCSC. This is all beyond my pay grade, but I'm hoping it provokes the sort of discussion David and Daniel created this symposium to think about. And I do look forward to all of your feedback. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Ken. Stephen?
Yeah, just really quick. No, really good presentation, Ken, and it kind of the way your talk overlaps a lot with my talk, although I kind of explored how the cultural DNA concerns our conceptions of, war, peace, and so forth. But very good, very good. And I think it also just shows like what's good about the big history format, and also the fact that we can come from these different perspectives and just share our perspectives. And even if we're not exactly on the exact same page, we're kind of heading in the same general direction. And I think that's just important for the big history field moving forward. So
I thank you, Stephen. It's the need to experiment and to play is, I think, really good, which Todd was really talking about. So, yeah.
yeah, and that's important, like how we're all bouncing ideas off, like, oh, this is what this guy said in his talk, this is what he said in this talk, and it's like we're bringing it all together. So yeah, it's like an ecosystem if you want to think of it that way.
Great. Any other comments, questions? Andre?
Yes, thanks. Ken, I enjoyed your talk. I would like to make two comments. One is that it's always important to remember that the myths that we inherit and that survive are written by the oral cultural elite and the written cultural elite. And they're written in specific contexts, that is, the temple, the palace, the city. In other words, these narratives emerge from the dominance hierarchies of these cultures, and they reflect and allegorize the dominance hierarchies of these cultures. Likewise, the history of these periods that we inherit are written by the elite, again, the oral and literate elite. And so it is no accident that you find correspondence between the elite written and oral myths and the elite oral and written histories that we've inherited. And that also works as a model for modernity as well. We are a deeply mythological culture. And I think I'll give you two examples there. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, is regarded as the founding document of modern economics, based on kind of Newtonian mechanist rationality. The market is a machine, and it is an equilibrium machine. And whenever that equilibrium falls out of balance, the invisible hand of God, which is the deist God, which is the God of rationalism, will always bring that rational market back into balance, which is a total and complete myth that does nothing but legitimate the dominance hierarchy of capitalism, because the oligarchs and plutocrats can always say that no matter how they're distorting the exchange relations of economics, it's all just part of the logical mechanism of the Newtonian universe and the Smithian version of the logical economic relations of this machine that we're all living in. In other words, it's a legitimation narrative for dominance hierarchies. And the same is exactly true of Marx. Marx had the brilliant insight that, of course, capitalism is an exploitative and oppressive system of class hierarchies and control of the means of production, where workers are reduced to their labor time and then exploited. Their labor time is literally stolen. Brilliant, perfect, wonderful idea and critique of capitalism, which then he totally mucks up, because he has absolutely no idea what he means by revolution or government. He absolutely disdains the notion of democracy, and he thinks that somehow, organically, once the workers reclaim their means and modes of production, these organic communes will magically appear instead. In other words, and then he even uses the phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat. In other words, Marx and communism is another myth legitimating a new dominance hierarchy. And it's no surprise that we then get fascist dictators in the 20th century and communist dictators in the 20th century, whose empires are legitimated on the one hand by the myth of Adam Smith's mechanist rational market, and on the other hand, the myth of Marx's communist utopia. So myth and history are both intricately inseparable in the elite control in ancient times and in the elite control and articulation in modern times. And we are a deeply mythic culture, which is something that perhaps big history can think more critically about.
Thank you very much. Apparently, this has been going on since the end of the Ice Age, and you began to get larger and larger communities who needed people to control them because you couldn't know everyone you lived with. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it's important to stop making value judgments about this. This is the way the world is. And if we're going to create an effective society, we have to live with that knowledge. And anyway, Todd, you.
There we go. Still trying to figure out how to unmute. So thank you, Ken. I really appreciate your point about experimenting, right? And the play, like we were talking about a bit before. But so I'm wondering, let's see if I can articulate this thought. So I like the idea of that you try out ideas and ways of telling stories about things, and then so I guess I'm trying to make that complementary with Ken Solis's point about the boundaries and thinking about, okay, so maybe here's the question is, do you see, I'm imagining you can play and experiment in relation to a particular goal of where you're trying to get with, you're trying to experiment to figure out how to make something work well. And you can also experiment with the goals themselves, right? Of like, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And so I'd just be interested in your thoughts about it. Are the goals also part of the play, or do you see it as like there's a
Oh,
clear goal and then we're trying to play to get there?
absolutely. I think the main thing about the emerging paradigm is that all those boundaries that the Clockwork Universe taught us to see are arbitrary. And it's like I was saying with learning. Learning is not purely intellectual. You you create a model in your mind, but until you enact it, you don't know it. And it's that reiterative process that allows you to learn. And the same way with goals and how you meet them. Um, it's all fair, but and there the question of how you put up the guardrails is a big one that we need to deal with.
Thanks.